Game Boy Advance SP, a absolute childhood favorite console of mine that I played for many hours in the past. The Game Boy Advance brought some of the most favorite titles I had ever played on a handheld console from Nintendo. Games such as Super Mario World, the Gen 3 Pokemon series such as Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, Zelda, the Minish Cap, and many more that I really enjoyed. So I really enjoyed modding that Game Boy Color that we did in the last video, which for those of you guys that didn't see it, we took a old Game Boy Color that was fully functional. Everything worked on it, but we just modded it and brought it up to a little bit more updated specs. We put a funny playing IPS screen in it, replaced the shell and the buttons, and really gave it a nice renovation, and it's really enjoyable to play on, and the screen is absolutely beautiful. So that definitely, I had such a good time modding that Game Boy. I wanted to do something with the Game Boy Advance SP, so I scooped up a old AGS 101, and this one actually needs a lot of help. It doesn't have a screen in it, it's missing the battery. Basically, the only thing that this thing came with was the shell that you see and then the actual motherboard inside. So we're going to be redoing this Game Boy and bringing it back to life. So as far as what we're going to be doing to this particular AGS 101 is we are going to be obviously putting some sort of display in it. I did pick up a aftermarket IPS display from the Retro Gaming Repair Shop. It needs a battery, so I do have a replacement battery we'll be putting in this one, and it didn't come with a charger, so I also have a charger for it. And I wasn't going to at first, but seeing this shell is pretty worn down, we're probably going to replace the shell too. So, and I'll have all the parts that I'm using in this video linked below, so you guys can check those out. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So I mean, most of what we're going to be reusing is basically just the motherboard inside. We are going to be doing pretty much a full remodel on this particular AGS 101. Okay guys, with all of that out of the way, let's get started. There's definitely a huge feeling of nostalgia when powering on a Game Boy Advance SP. Seeing and hearing the tone coming from the boot up screen definitely brings back a lot of memories. In comparison to the Game Boy Color mod that we did recently, I would say the Game Boy Advance SP is definitely a trickier handheld to work on, and I think that's mostly due to the fact that this is a hinged device. So working in the areas of the ribbon cable, getting it to properly loop through the hinge is a little bit tricky, and then having enough room to connect it into the ribbon cable connector on the motherboard can get a little bit tight. There's not a whole lot of room to work and a whole lot of slack with that ribbon cable. Although this wasn't a tutorial where I walked through and talked step by step, I just kind of showed the footage of me doing the rebuild on this Game Boy Advance SP. I am going to go over some of the trickier parts and some recommendations on how to get the job done a little bit easier. Removing the shell and the motherboard from the shell is pretty easy. You just have a mix of Phillips head screws and some tri-wing screws, but they come out pretty easy and they're all pretty accessible. If you need to disassemble the screen portion of your original Advance SP, it can be kind of tricky removing the rubber pads. I found it's best to take some sort of tiny flathead bit, kind of round out the edge of the circular pads and push towards the center, and they pop out pretty easy using that technique. Removing these screen hinge retaining pins is a real pain in the ass, and a lot of people recommend that you just buy new ones. Unfortunately, I didn't have any around, so I ended up just reusing the ones from the SP that we were redoing. But once the rear of these pins are exposed, you'll just have to try and retract the ridges that are keeping them held in and get them pushed through the hole that it is retaining. You can start removing these pins with the SP hinge semi-closed, but in order for them to be fully removed, you have to open the hinge to the completely open position. With this particular IPS display and many others I've seen on the market, it does require some cutting to the Game Boy Advance SP shell, which wasn't too bad because I did have some pretty good snips that I use for 3D printing stuff all the time, and there's not a whole lot of cutting to do. So basically you just want to cut this ridge down to where it's flush with the surface of the outer SP shell. Connecting this tab from the IPS display to its motherboard can be really tricky. In fact, I screwed it up and didn't have it connected properly, so when I first tried to power on the Game Boy Advance SP, I didn't get any sort of display. I did end up opening it back up and saw that this connector wasn't properly connected to the IPS display. Once I fixed that connection, we did get a boot up screen. Because this is a circular hinge, the ribbon cable coming from the display's motherboard does have to get wrapped in the circular portion of the hinge and face outwards to connect to the motherboard. Just make sure it curls around nicely and doesn't get pinched by any of the shell. The soldering we did was just to enable the brightness control to this particular IPS display. This step is completely optional, but I definitely wanted to have the brightness control, and the soldering really wasn't too bad, especially if you have some sort of tacky flux to help the solder adhere to these small vias on the motherboard. Another reason I had to take apart this build when I finally had it assembled is I didn't have any sound, and come to find out that this wire that controls the brightness was actually interfering with the contacts on the speaker. So just make sure you have this wire kind of tucked in out of the way from anything that needs some sort of contact, so make sure it's out of the way of the speakers and the other buttons. But that is it, guys. Like I said, this was a little bit trickier of a build slash modification versus the Game Boy Color build that I did. Overall, this retro remodel turned out really well. The IPS display is really beautiful. The colors are brilliant and the brightness is insane. There are quite a few stages of brightness levels that you can control with this particular display. I usually leave it on some of the lower settings because the higher ones are definitely pretty harsh to look at. I am a big fan of the new shell we put on this. I love the red color. There are quite a few different color options and styles that you can go with. I did want to go with something a little bit more OEM looking, so I chose the red. I never owned a red SP back in the day. I had the blue AGS 001 and then I had a silver AGS 101. So I decided to go with the red to change it up a little bit, but still have that OEM feel. I think the best part about this build is having access to all those old titles that I used to love to play. I already sunk quite a bit of time into some of the Kirby Dream Land titles and Pokemon Ruby. I think what stopped me the most from getting into retro modding and building some sort of emulation handhelds is the fact that this is all pretty accessible through a desktop emulator of some sort or loading it up on a Raspberry Pi. But I've really come to find out that it's just so much better playing it on the original hardware, especially when that hardware is modded and has better displays than they used to have and stuff like that to make the gaming experience that much more enjoyable. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a like on it, and if you want to see more tech related videos and more retro modding related videos, be sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments. As always guys, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.